Could our reliance on gray infrastructure be a costly mistake? Let's look at green infrastructure, specifically living shorelines, and how that might be the way forward. Hi, I'm Mike with EasternEcosystems.com and UnitedDesigners.org, here to talk about one of my favorite green infrastructures, living shorelines. So in this video, we're going to do a brief introduction of, for those of you that aren't familiar with green infrastructure, what that is and how that differs from gray infrastructure. Then we're going to go a little more into living shorelines, the benefits, and it's not always the best solution. So we'll take a look at that. This is the first in a series of videos exploring this topic, and I hope you stay tuned for it. So let's briefly make sure we're all on the same page with the definition of green infrastructure. The UN defines it as a network providing the ingredients for solving urban and climatic challenges by building with nature. The European Commission, a network of natural and semi-natural areas that are strategically planned and managed to provide a variety of ecosystem services and increase biodiversity. And then the Environmental Protection Agency of the US defines it as the range of measures that use plant or soil systems, permeable pavements, or other permeable surfaces or substrates, stormwater harvest and reuse, or landscape to store, infiltrate, and evapotranspirate. So the EPA is looking at it mainly from stormwater management. The UN is looking at it in terms mainly of urban, because that's a lot of times where it occurs, but it's not limited to that. Green infrastructure encompasses a great number of practices, strategies, tactics, that kind of thing, not limited to stormwater management, not limited to the urban environment. But with those definitions, we understand that those are the majority of the places that green infrastructure is implemented. So as I mentioned, we're looking at living shorelines as one type of green infrastructure. So what exactly is a living shoreline? So it can be defined, there are many definitions. One of them, I think it's from NOAA, defines it as a coastal edge that's stabilized and protected using natural materials like sand, rock, and plants. So that leaves a lot of room for interpretation there. And there are many variations of what living shorelines might look like. There are different components, and we'll get into the design and understanding the assessment and design process for selecting the most appropriate approach to a living shoreline. And as I mentioned, living shorelines might not be necessarily the best approach. But components of living in shorelines. So we're looking at vegetation, organic materials. So vegetation obviously is an organic material, but there are other organic materials like core logs or other things that might be used. And structural elements. This can include stone. Now, you look at riprap, we're using stone in a different way than we use it in riprap to armor a shore. And then you could also be including, depending on where you're at, oyster castles. And then we'll go into, again in later video, the roles and benefits of each one of these components. So let's talk a little bit about why are we going to use a living shoreline. So just like we utilize for gray infrastructure, whether it be seawalls, riprap, bulkheads, that type of thing, are really trying to protect the shoreline from erosion a lot of times. And one of the other benefits of these is that with storms and high tides, and we're seeing this more and more with climate change. You can check out one of my other videos where I filmed actually climate change sort of happening, where you see rising sea level and the impact that's having. So we're looking at storm impact, reducing the storm impact, whether that's wave action, reducing the flooding of it, erosion control. Erosion might be caused by the impact of waves, whether they're generated by wind or boat wakes, or it could be from upland erosion control, eroding the shoreline. And then we want to look at habitat creation as one of those other benefits, and water quality improvement. The area that I'm in now, the Chesapeake Bay watershed and the east coast of the United States, there are three main drivers, three main goals and measures by which they use as metrics for some of the programs, and that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment reduction. And living shorelines can not only reduce those, but it can also reduce other pollutants, and it can really improve the water quality. All right, definitions are out of the way. Now that we're all on the same page, let's talk about why we might choose green infrastructure over gray infrastructure. So there's some obvious answers, such as the environment. The environment benefits a great deal. We're creating habitat. We're utilizing a system that naturally occurs to meet the needs of our society and civilization. So by utilizing this system, this natural system, and creating this natural, reinstituting this natural system that occurred, probably before human interaction and climate change and all these different things started affecting it, now we're providing a system, place for that system to exist. And along with that comes all of the benefits, all of the biodiversity, the wildlife, the flora, the fauna, all of these things that occur. And it gives that system the ability to migrate upland as climate changes. We'll get into that later on in one of the other videos. But there's also social benefits. Living shorelines do come with socio and economic benefits. And the economic ones are the ones that sometimes can be a little counterintuitive for folks because there's the obvious economic benefit of tourism. People come there to that shoreline for scenery. Parks sometimes are go hand in hand with that, recreation activities, but it can also be significantly cheaper, not just in living shorelines, but green infrastructure in general can be significantly cheaper than gray infrastructure. And some people are a little surprised by that because we're used to the cost of creating gray infrastructure, our roads, and if in the case of coastal erosion and shoreline erosion, bulkheads, riprap, and people will say, well, aren't we using some of the same materials? So material cost, labor cost, all of these things. How can green infrastructure, how can living shorelines be cheaper than gray infrastructure? Well, if you look over the lifetime of this project and of this infrastructure, green infrastructure can sometimes be significantly cheaper because lower maintenance costs. We are harnessing a process, a pattern, an ecosystem that naturally occurs. So once we've created the conditions for it to thrive, maintain those conditions, manage those conditions, remove the things causing damage, these things will often, one, they'll self organize, but they'll also somewhat and sometimes completely self regulate. Sometimes we just have to create the environment, so to speak, of for this system to thrive, for this ecosystem to thrive. And where with gray infrastructure, there's maintenance costs, there's upkeep costs. And as climate changes, sea level rises, in the case of living shorelines or gray infrastructure, bulkheads, seawalls, that kind of thing, what happens when the sea level rise, which we're already seeing in my area, it's already come up a few inches and we're seeing coastal flooding happening significantly more often. So what happens when these changes, these climatic changes, overwhelm the gray infrastructure? Well, with green infrastructure, if designed right and other conditions being appropriate, like the ability to move inland, these systems can also migrate. So we don't have to rebuild the system every time we have a variable change in the environmental conditions. Now, one thing to consider as we're talking about these green infrastructure, and we're talking, a natural, pretty much a natural system that we're increasing that biodiversity and creating that habitat, but it's not limited to the completely natural shoreline. So when we discuss living shorelines and green and gray infrastructure, it's not just one or the other. There's a scale. And so you have your natural systems that we can utilize as green infrastructure. Here we're talking living shorelines. It could also be constructed wetlands, and then you have gray infrastructure, concrete pipes, stormwater drains, that type of thing, bulkheads, seawalls, riprap. But you can also have a hybrid. So, in the case of, uh, for example, if you've seen my post on floating wetlands in the Baltimore Harbor, there was one that was constructed. So, it's a combination, it's engineered, but it also utilizes a lot of natural systems, processes, and elements to achieve the same goal where green infrastructure may have not been possible. So that brings me to my last point where sometimes green infrastructure isn't the appropriate answer. There are use cases for gray infrastructure. And when talking about these two, we'll talk in the future videos, we'll go into some use cases and some case studies showing different scenarios and how living shoreline was used to accomplish the goals. But sometimes gray infrastructure is just necessary, especially in urban areas where you might not have the land necessary to create a living shoreline. You maybe have no other option than to use gray infrastructure. A good example of this is maybe in a narrow channel where normally it's a stream that ran through there or a tidal stream, that pond that went through there, but now you have boat traffic running through there, which is causing wake. But you have a narrow stream channel With relatively steep banks, you might not be able to implement a living shoreline there. You might need to go with some kind of bulkhead or riprap or that type of gray infrastructure to protect that shoreline from erosion from the boat wakes. Well, that concludes our introduction video to green infrastructure and specifically living shorelines. Went over a few definitions, talked a little more in depth about what exactly a living shoreline is, some of the components, that type of thing, and use cases. Now we'll go into further depth and detail on all these in future videos, and again, mentioning why we sometimes might want to use gray infrastructure in these cases. Appreciate you watching. If you found this video helpful and useful and think somebody else might, please feel free to share. You can also feel free to reach out to me on Mike at easternecosystems.com. The website there, happy to answer any questions you might have, and stay tuned for future videos. Thanks for watching.